When we often think of race, many of us have been taught that race is a defined category based on biological differences or uniqueness. Though these differences have yet to be proven scientifically through any real research, it has been limited to a single phenotypic marker, and that's skin color. If this is the case, this would explain why there was a coordinated move in the 17th and 18th centuries to place human beings into a racialized hierarchy based on this single marker. But that's not the whole story. See, I've yet to see a person who's actually black or white or red or yellow. I've come to learn that race is a social-politically constructed idea. And this idea was formed in colonial Virginia and Maryland in the late 1600s. Now, before you counter that last claim, take a few minutes and search the net and see if you can find a group of people that called themselves white prior to the late 1600s in America. No, I'm just being, I was just tripping. I'm not serious about that. But if you find any documented proof, please hit me up and we can talk about it. I'm always open to constructive dialogue. Noted scholar Theodore Allen conducted extensive research, scouring colonial records, and could not find a single document that referred to a group of people as white in colonial America until the late 1600s. But keeping it real, this isn't something I learned about in school, didn't learn about in high school or college or even graduate school, or even when I taught American history. It just wasn't in the history books, not in the curriculum. So I didn't know anything about it until a few years ago. Long story short, there was a serious battle, conflict in Virginia that occurred in 1676. We know about 1776, but the Bacon Rebellion was a bloody conflict that lasted about a year, and it was disastrous, resulting in several laws being enacted in these two colonies that eventually led to the construction of the race that we now call white. I'm Dr. Du Bois Teddy McMillan, and this is an 8-minute gem on Bacon's Rebellion and how a group of people began classifying themselves as white. Let's check it out. Before we begin discussing how Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement on the North American continent in 1607, funded by the Virginia Company of London, it's important to kind of get an idea of what was going on in Europe prior to this extremely important point in history. We look at nearly 300 years prior when in 1349, a major labor issue came up in England after a devastating outbreak of the bubonic plague, which also was called Black Death. It ravaged the country and depleted a huge part of its labor force. Having a population around 5 million, it's estimated that upwards of 40% of the population died, or 2 million, within a short 2-year period. As a result, there was a sharp increase in demand for skilled workers, and this created friction between who they called the elite of Europe and its workers. It's basic mathematics. More work needed, fewer workers, the demand of workers increased. As skilled workers pressed the elite for higher wages, there was a series of statutes passed to fix wages on workers and essentially control the lives of laborers. Fast forward, this practice continued in 1562. Queen Elizabeth passed what was called the Statute of Artificers, which solidified this concept of controlling the lives of workers by limiting wages, limiting movement of people that were considered lower class, and effectively sparked tremendous growth in agriculture. To refresh, this was the age of exploration. Several other European explorers left their land to explore what they called the New World. England, with a population increase and policies passed to favor the wealthy, just left the poor eager to jump on the opportunity to venture into this new land, this new world. I won't get into the papal bulls passed in the 15th centuries that added fuel to this massive push to colonize lands outside of European boundaries. I'll get into this in another video. But what I will touch on is this. Subjecting Africans to slavery wasn't a new thing. The Portuguese had already had it going. Prince Henry the Navigator abducted people from Guinea and sold them at an auction in the 1440s. What's important to know is these enslaved Africans were essentially taken from their land and sent to Europe, and from there they had been taken to the Caribbean, South America, and other areas across the world. But in 1518, things changed. King Charles signed an edict that made it possible for Europeans to abduct and capture West Africans and take them directly to the area that they call the New World. Now let's go back to Jamestown. It was settled in 1607, named after King James I. They chose this area for two main reasons. First, 3 sides of the land were surrounded by water, which made it optimal for defending the settlement against attack from the Spanish, the French, and Native American groups. The other reason is there were very few Native Americans in this specific area near the Chesapeake Bay. And though the Spanish explorers Hernando de Soto and Juan Pardo had ventured into these lands in 1542 and 1567 respectively, and there had been previous attempts at settlement by the English, this became the very first permanent settlement of the English. I guess you can call it trial and error. But check this out. The first few years were brutal. Sickness, disease, lives lost in battle with the indigenous people made the settlement extremely unstable. And in 1619, the first recorded cargo ship landed in Jamestown. There were 20 Africans on the ship that believed to have been from Angola, and based on reports, they said that they were 20 and odd. It's important to know that there were roughly 700 people in Virginia colony at this time. There were English landowners or planters who paid for indentured servants from England to come over and work on the tobacco plantations for a period of 3 to 7 years under a contract. And at the end of the contract, they were to receive land and tools and weapons and other resources to get started on their journey to gain riches. Remember, many of the indentured servants were poor in England and saw this as an opportunity to improve their lives. The Africans, on the other hand, were enslaved. They were not indentured servants. It's important to make that distinction. Even though much of the research suggests that indentured servants and enslaved Africans were treated fairly the same in early Virginia colonial history. Let's get to the economics. The big cash crop here was tobacco. Tobacco is extremely hard to grow, is labor intensive, and requires hard physical labor to grow and maintain. But it was in high demand in the early 1600s. Records show that a colonist by the name of John Rolfe began experimenting with tobacco seeds in the Chesapeake area around 1611 and created a more mild form of tobacco, allegedly. It's known that the indigenous people were also smoking tobacco, so he could have gotten tips from them. But let's keep it pushing. In 1612, Rolfe sent his first crop of his newly formed tobacco blend back to England. And it wasn't as bitter as the previous blends, and the English loved it. By 1618, the colony had produced and exported about 20,000 pounds of tobacco, and that number grew to about 500,000 by 1627 and 1.5 million by 1629. With this success, the number of people in the colony grew. Planters can get an additional 50 acres of land with every new indentured servant they had under contract. This, coupled with the demand for land from those that were completed their indentured contracts, created an issue between William Barclay, who was the governor of Virginia at the time. So those who were completing their contracts looked to the planter and the government to make good on the promise. So this created a problem that led to Bacon's Rebellion. The elite, many of whom lived on the coast of the Atlantic, were somewhat removed from direct contact with indigenous groups. This wasn't the case with the common planter. One by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, cousin of William Barclay, took issue. Based on a letter written by Bacon's wife to her sister, dated June 26, 1676, Bacon had written several letters to Governor Barclay to appeal for him to assist the English planters in dealing with the indigenous groups who had attacked and killed some Englishmen in the area, including one who was Bacon's overseer. She calls the people troublesome Indians. In addition to lives being lost, she claims that they had taken cattle. She took it as far as saying Barclay was friends with the natives and wouldn't harm a single one. So without swift action from Barclay to move against the natives and pay them back for their actions, she claims the poor came to her husband and appealed to him to assist. Bacon had 500 men, English indentured servants, and enslaved Africans, and also freemen attacked the natives without commission for Barclay. They ravished many of the surrounding areas and native communities and killed many people. This turned into a bloody conflict. The group eventually marched to the House of Burgesses and burned it down. Her claim was there was no one against Bacon but the governor and a few of his great friends who had gotten estates from the governor. Barclay was extremely angry with Bacon for this and ordered him to be captured and hanged. Bacon eventually got sick and passed away in October of 1676. Troops were sent to quell the conflict, and based on an account by one British naval commander, Thomas Grantham, there were free men, indentured men, and enslaved men. So the research tells us that there was a problem with social control. If the system was to work for the economic goals of the colonies, a control mechanism had to be put in place to ensure incidents like Bacon's Rebellion would not occur. Indentured servants and enslaved Africans working together to challenge the system was not going to happen again. The planters weren't going to allow an alliance between the two groups. As a strategy, the English colonists employed a very simple tactic. They elevated the status of the English person with the least amount of wealth, power, and prestige and placed them above any African person, While Africans were viewed as hereditary slaves, indentured servants were given special rights through laws that targeted African Americans and Native Americans. At the rebellion, these are some of the actions taken by the Virginia General Assembly. In 1676, Act 1, natives captured during the rebellion would be in captivity for life. 1680, Act 7, punishment for raising a hand at a Christian could get you 30 lashes. Or running away from the plantation without permission and resisting arrest could result in death. It wasn't lawful for any Negro to carry a club, a staff, a gun, sword, or any other weapon in defense or offense. In 1682, Act 3, enslaved people were not able to congregate on the plantation other than their own for more than 4 hours. In April of 1691, which is a very critical one, this is Act 16, limited manumission of the enslaved. Freed persons had to be taken out of the colony within 6 months. Interracial couples had to leave the colony. White women were punished for marrying non-white men, and this was really specific to African men. This is the first time in colonial records that the term white was associated with a group of people. Prior to this, the main terms were English and Christian. After Bacon's Rebellion, the focus centered on Africans as the main source of labor and with the lifetime tag as a slave. What was happening at the same time was the expansion and codification of whiteness to include other European groups, and the shaping of white to form the ideological premise that anyone classified as white was superior to those in any non-white category, not just in theory, but through legal and social practice. A simple search of the etymology of the word white used to describe a group of people, you'll find it somewhere in the late 1600s. So by 1700, we see a sharp increase in the number of enslaved Africans in the colony, to a point to where they outnumbered the number of whites in the colony. Two of the most accurate definitions of race I have come across are Dorothy Roberts, who states, race is a political system that separates people based on invented biological demarcation. And also I take a look at Theodore Allen's definition, who claimed that race is a ruling class social control formation. So there we have it. Race is a social politically constructed idea that was formed after Bacon's Rebellion and used strategically to separate and influence life experience based on one biological marker, and that's skin color. This concept expanded in the 18th and 19th centuries with the work of people like Carl Linnaeus, who created a taxonomy that organized human beings into various classifications. His work on race was highly generalized and had no scientific backing. My name is Dr. Du Bois Teddy McMillan. I want to thank you for tuning in to this 8-minute gem on Bacon's Rebellion. I hope it was informative. Thanks to Glide One for this beat. See you next time.